never know how long that work that we just went through then will take. And sometimes if there's a lot of resistance, we just have to keep hanging out there and just keep letting it go and sort of try to reflect progress just if they're getting a bit closer. But for me, all of that work is preliminary because to me, I don't have any confidence that any change is really happening until we get into that moment where we get to explore what happens for that person much more precisely when they cross over from being in contact and cohesive, regulated, and then experience that moment as somehow threatening enough to then that split returns. And that's the moment I'm always sort of heading for, because if we can't get inside that moment and understand the mechanics of that moment, I don't think the guy's really got the tools to be able to reorganize himself to respond differently to that distress. And they tend to have very cyclical relationships that just follow the same pattern. And it's only a matter of time for typically the partner, unfortunately, too often settles into and takes a long time to find out that these guys are quite abusive, or sees them coming and just gets out of there in the nick of time sort of thing. So just now that we're there, we want to move into how to sort of deal or get into that moment and sort of deal with it. So if we look at this, we're just looking at that treatment model there. So at this point, I'm thinking we're really ready to go into the details, a bit more psycho-ed. And I'll often present this as me putting my cards on the table. I'm going to be really honest with you, and just let you in on just how I'm operating and what I'm aiming to do and the way I'm working. And if you're okay with it, I think it can be really empowering for you to get some of that understanding. Would you be okay if we just did a little bit of psycho-ed around the kind of things we've been talking about, conflict resolution, what happens to us when we become a bit overwhelmed, and really seek and get their active commitment to wanting to do this. I find most guys at this point, once you've done that other work, they're really quite keen to understand it. They're looking for an answer, because if they're still with you at this point, they're quite aware that something's happening that they don't like and they can't stop, much like you would when you're working with a substance abuser or a gambler or any compulsive activity. So I'll just sort of basically keep it pretty basic. I like taking them through these 5 stages of engagement. The different self states have those ideas. You can look at that idea of coherence and splitting and what's going on at that neurobiological level a little bit. And this is all to help them map that transition from coherent engagement to losing it or splitting or halving or whatever you might want to call that. So I sort of go to the whiteboard at this point and I'll say to them, look, when I sit with you, I don't just sit with this sort of cognition. You're not just your thoughts, and I just explain to them, I'm working with you as a client who, like me, like everyone else, is made up of 3 interlocking systems. And when we're doing really well, like now, you seem pretty calm, you seem pretty good, we'd expect these 3 systems to be working quite cohesively together. You've got your thoughts going, and the fact that we're having this conversation tells me that your body's not picking up any danger, any sense of danger. Your body's not interfering in your ability to think clearly, and you're not experiencing any really strong emotions that are interrupting your ability to stay connected cognitively with me. And the idea is to sort of extend that and just say, and give them this example and say, when you're in this state, when you and I are just talking like this, and all the time in your life, you're basically going through these basic steps, right? So, basic training, don't need to take you guys through this, but just those basic steps, around engagement, attention, perception, representation, memory, and reflection. And these guys are loving this and they're getting it normally, but they sort of need something to really bring it into context. So at this point, I really want to get them physically in the experience. So the main technique, I've got a tennis ball, and what I really want to do at this point is engage them in a physical activity that shifts them out of what we've just been doing. And I'll just grab a tennis ball and like go like this with them, and they're like, oh, and they realize what's going on. And I just sort of lob it across, and then I say catch, and we'll throw the tennis ball back and forward a few times. And at that point, I'll just jump back and say, you just went through these stages. Okay. And what I'll do at that point is just explain to them or suggest to them that the fact that you could catch that ball and keep talking to me and stay connected tells me that you were able to move from attention to perception. You formed a picture in your mind of what's going on. Your memory gave you all the information you need about what it is that's going on. And you stayed connected to your cognition enough to make a conscious decision to approach rather than avoid. And then I'll say, but if I picked up this pot plant, you'd be like, dude, no. But you wouldn't probably freak out. And at that point, I'll go to a more threatening scenario, and I'll suggest to them that, if I'd gone over to the drawer and pulled out a machete and you saw my face change into a really menacing look, and then I came at you with the machete, and then just leave it there, like, what would you do? Okay. And what I want them to really experience in the room is how organically natural it is for them at that point to stop, to sort of disconnect from cognition. It's highly likely, as we'll sort of share together and we'll chat about it, that they would stay calmly connected and make assessments of how quickly I'm moving towards them, where I possibly bought the machete from, and just throwing in a bit of humor around this. And just, again, what we're trying to do here, or I'm trying to do here, is completely naturalize the biology of splitting. I really want them to understand that there's nothing weird about splitting itself. And, and I might even run through the basics of trauma there, that if I give the example that if I left the building and was set upon, ended up in hospital for a few days, you'd expect me to be quite terrified to be back in this space and to leave the building. And just pointing out that difference to them between memory and reflection. Different people obviously will use different language with this chart. And what I'm really trying to do is just get that red line up and get that very, very clear that if you're perceiving that things are safe and okay, you can move pretty comfortably from, attention. Your memory will help you understand what's going on, and you'll be able to make that conscious decision to avoid, approach, and manage the situation in a way that you're comfortable with and that you've chosen to do. And at that point, I'll just sort of bring in this idea of threat and suggest that for anybody, once that threat gets strong enough and realistic enough, we would expect every normal human to then go in, they'll be outside their window of tolerance, and they're going to react to that moment and do whatever they need to do to survive. And I think most guys really, really appreciate getting that sense that, so this is a biological setup. And once we've got buy-in to this, once they really understand and appreciate that that's there, that's normal, that's natural, that puts us in a really strong position to be able to contest it. And what I really like doing here is just sort of throwing that around for a while and just seeing where the conversation goes. And quite often guys will talk about situations where they've been threatened or they've been, overwhelmed. They might bring up a trauma and share a time when they lost it when they were younger. They might even talk about seeing that happen in other areas, or even things like having a car accident. And I'm really happy to spend a good amount of time with those guys, really normalizing, naturalizing that biological setup. Because the more confident they are about the naturalness of that biological apparatus, the more we've got them in a position now where we can effectively question and go back to those 5 steps and come back to perception. And then we get to really look at threat perception. And it's at that point, well, no, oh my God, I hit the wrong button. Had to happen. Oh, that's a good recovery. We're back. And that's where I think it's really important to sort of go back to that sort of rule of masculinity and talking about, well, you know, you're a guy, right? So what have you always been taught about threat? What do you do if you see a threat? And it's like, you know, you've got to neutralize it. And what happens if you don't? And guys really, I think a lot of guys feel very resentful that there's not a lot of understanding that gets extended to them about their experiences trying to be vulnerable. It's like, yeah, well, the last time I tried to be vulnerable as an 8-year-old or as a 14-year-old, you know, I was bullied for 2 years. I'm trying to think of it as, I think it's Carol Gilligan's partner's name, but anyway, he tells a story of his, you know, being 5 or 6 years old and having a really beautiful lullaby that was his favorite song. And being at school, I think it's 6 or something, and the teacher was asking people to say what their favorite song is and would they be prepared to sing a little song. And this kid got up and teacher asked him what it was, and he said it was, you know, it's a lullaby. And he was prepared to go and sing that song, but at that point, the looks on all the boys' faces in the room, and even the teacher, was this immediate feedback, just no way, do not do this. And he understood implicitly in a millisecond. And he said, no, I'm just joking. And then he suggested a different song, which was like an army marching song. So he went all the way the other way and presented himself as if he was this. Yeah, so you get the idea. These guys feel very, what's the word, resentful, I think, about there being so little understanding about how hard it is for them to not react, even though they don't really understand that training. So again, what we're trying to do is just really, you know, connect them back to that training, legitimize it so that we can then question it. So then there's this idea of, yeah, what happens if you don't keep control? And then we want to go out into the world and explore with them, you know, what's going on in those times in their relationships when they don't keep control and what their experience of that is. So it's all leading to this little procession we want to go through now. You'll see my lovely dinky little drawings, and I've put these in like this because I often will work at this stage with a whiteboard. And again, I find for a lot of guys having something that's not just in the frame, because a lot of this stuff for guys, it's them being seen as they get towards vulnerability. Being seen itself is quite threatening. The whiteboard allows us to sort of get away from that dyad intensity, and almost by putting it up on the wall, again, we've got that shift in the dynamic where we're standing alongside them, looking at the situation. So I want to really take them through this process here because I'm guiding them towards this moment of splitting, you know. And the first thing I'll do is just put this image up and I'll say sort of, you know, so here you are, you know, you're sitting here with me and how would you say you feel? And I really want to elicit from the client here this idea that they're calm, they're okay, everything's pretty good, they feel cohesive. And I'll really reflect that back to them and say, yeah, that's exactly how I found you. Everything seems pretty fine. At this point, I really want to just sort of list some of his strengths. I'm going to go, so here you are, right? You're just sitting here right now. And as you experience yourself here, do you feel clear? Do you feel strong? Like, do you feel that you're good in your job? And I'll just try to point to a few areas in their life where they feel quite confident. So I want to just really land the idea of this guy at this point. This client is a coherent person. Their cognition, their primary and secondary affect are all sort of working together in this lovely cohesive way. So I'm really trying to build that up again. So now I want to sort of say to them, so when you're like this, you spend time like this with your partner, like or with people that you're close to, right? And I want them to notice that that same person that's sitting there that's really calm and really coherent is actually fine in relationship, at least a good amount of the time, as long as everything's going well and that things are not threatening. And I really point that out so that when things are okay and there's no threat, no reason to perceive any threat, you stay really regulated and everything's going well. Then we just want to move them back, and I'll just come back to this setup and just run them through and say, you remember what we were doing maybe in an earlier session? And I'll just run them through these again and just sort of get them to notice that when they're connected in relationship, they function very effectively and they stay connected to all these steps, and point out to them that the key thing there is that when their perception, they're not perceiving threat. So that tells them that they're in control. There's nothing to be too worried about. Then get them and just say to them, so what happens if you start to experience some tension with your partner? And I suppose what we're trying to do here is slow it right down. And we're sort of almost wanting to track second by second shift here. And I might even rely on or see if they can choose a past argument or some recent experience where they've become a bit overwhelmed and then maybe reacted badly, or maybe gone into a full-blown coercively controlling or abusive response to this perceived threat. But having them in the room there, we're drawing the conflict towards them, but we keep coming back to this regulated person in the room and keep clocking them and getting them to stay with you, and give them as much time as they need to stay in the zone of processing and coherent processing. And this point, we want to notice, I sort of bring up to them that once we're perceiving threat and then going to this idea that there's starting to be pressure on this connection between this function, this process 1, 2, 3, 4, and your ability to sort of calmly and accurately reflect upon what's going on before you and make calm, positive functional decisions. And at that point, I'm going to ask them, can you remember that feeling of, the last time? Can you remember when you started to feel a little uncomfortable? What was happening? So we're looking to really sort of flesh out, because what I'm trying to do is get these guys to experience that there's a series of phases that they go through when they transition from coherent or regulated to dysregulated. Because every one of these guys, I think if you can say one thing that they almost all have in common, is they experience it as, and they'll all use it, I lost it, I snapped, I went crazy. And often the victim survivors will describe exactly the same behavior. He seemed fine, and then just like that, over nothing. I had no idea what caused him to snap. So what we're looking to do is just see that it wasn't a snap. There was actually a build-up and there was a crossover. And that's where we're trying to slow it down and really, in a narrative sense, we're trying to really thicken that part of the story. So now we want to bring our good friend shame into the room. So I'll often say, when you're getting to that point and you think back at the last time you were under pressure like that, what happened? What happened next? And this is really, really challenging. It's like anyone processing any trauma. It's trauma because it overwhelmed cognition in the first place. So to be able to articulate, what happened then, we'll know the shortcomings of CBT in this area, and yet we're in the room and we're talking. So that's why it's just so important to give a lot of space. Like I say, I think it's good to have the screen as that sort of way to reduce the pressure on the dyad. And I think at that point, if they can slow down and realize there was a moment where it felt like it's too much. And when I go to ask them about that, I'm really interested in that moment where they can reflect that they can't remember, or they can't explain it. And that's where I really want to hang out. I'm like, wow, what's that like? You know, you're sitting here now and I've experienced you all this time today. You've been in the room. You're clear, you're coherent, you're articulate. You're able to explain to me everything right up to here. But what's it like to notice that in that moment, you can't account for yourself. You have no explanation of what happens. And we're really trying to sort of open the ground here to recognize or to get them almost curious about what that is. So we're trying to sort of ease into a shame space, but keep them connected and processing. So to make the point a little stronger, another one of my fabulous little whiteboard drawings here. The client reacts to conflict is the idea here. Now, the shame spiral, and we hear a lot about this humiliated fury and the shame spiral. The idea is here that it's cascading, and there's flooding and all sorts of things going on in that neurocognition space. So what's happened at this point is they've experienced themselves failing. If the aim is to stay in control and they experience themselves in control, but if they're perceiving too much threat and they can't get to cognition, we want to sort of be able to explain to them and have them grasping that at that point, they're acting out of memory and there's that history. And what we want to suggest is that memory cause, when they react in that way, that causes them to break their own rule because they've lost control. And because they've grown up with this very deep implicit rule that they're still observing, that they must under no circumstances be seen as vulnerable or out of control. Again, we notice the necessity for another person to be present for shame to really spiral. And this is often when we work with victim survivors, this is the most troubling moment. Because at this moment, the victim survivor is committing grievous crimes against this perpetrator simply because she has eyes in her head. And I really can't emphasize this enough, you know, that for a lot of these guys, this is a replication of the moment of being shamed. We talked before about that psychopathology around withholding cold mother or a strongly shaming father. That experience of shame then is all about the need to disappear. So what we'd expect is all their behaviors, the adaptive behaviors to that trauma, are about concealment, which brings us back to, you know, that root of the word shame. The root of the word shame is from the Germanic to cover, to conceal. And the job of shame is to get concealed. So a lot of their behavior that we've been mapping and tracking in all of our sessions is now available to us as what they do to conceal that moment of shame. And what we want to get to is that rule. So hang on, what is it that needs to be hidden? Why is it so painful that someone can see you in that way? Why does it spiral? So at that point, I think, you know, if we can come back into the room with these guys and just say, like, wow, what's it like with me? Like talking about this now. And it's sort of a blank there. And if that blank happens, to me, that's a bit of a good sign because it tells me they're sort of in that zone. And my job there is just to hang out and just not bring any judgment, just to hang out. And if they start zoning out a bit, just bring them back. How you going? What's it like? And just get some really general checking in feedback. But what we're trying to do is replace that moment of separation with a moment of connection. So if I can stay with that guy in that moment and not judge him, we get to break the rule that he couldn't do this on his own, right? Because if he tried to work that through on his own, he's already observing the rule by doing it privately. It's got to happen in contact. So if I can be there with him in that moment, we get to break that rule that he can never be seen to fail. And at that point, if we can sort of hang out there, I think we're starting to, you know, get into that fundamental mechanism of the, you know, trauma trigger. because we want to remember that for these guys, this is a post-trauma situation, which is so baffling, and it's so hard to get our head around that when we consider the trauma they're about to inflict as a way to manage their post-traumatic distress. So that's when I'll sort of bring in the process. Sorry, that little, just do a cross or something, just put a T there or name it as trauma. And what we want to sort of get the guy to see there is at that point, his ability to be connected interpersonally with his partner, that is over. And he wants that wall to be there because he's gone to his trauma and he's in a shame spiral because no one's meant to see this. So, for all of us working with trauma, this is exactly where we're always trying to get to, that moment of contact with that territory and the emotions, especially shame, humiliation around that, so we can sort of, reframe that scenario. So I think if we can sort of land that, we're on our way to knowing that this person is genuinely capable of change. Okay, so I've just taken you through the ideal scenario. And I guess one of the things we have to ask ourselves when we're working with these guys and really weigh up is, when is the right time to go for this? Because to me, unless I'm finding there's a sense of opening around the curiosity to what's going on in that moment and why they fight, unless there's at least curiosity around that and a genuine desire, visible desire on their part to understand it, if that's not there, we're not going to do this at this point and deflect. And then I've sort of, in a way, I've sort of played that out and it's failed. And then, then it can become, then that person can sort of experience more defense. And I'd suggest that sort of more empowers his defensiveness, which is exactly what we're always trying to get past, that defensiveness, and to get to where this sort of separation occurs and the vulnerability and the intolerance of that distress. So I'm hoping that makes sense. I suppose, I guess, well, I just respond to a question someone put in earlier before the break. And I think this is really important because you're right. The person asking this question asks about whether curiosity around vulnerable topics is enough to get past the defenses of, narcissistic types who are unlikely to have much capacity for self-reflection, and how changeable is this? Okay, so that is the $64,000 question, isn't it?
Is a narcissist going to love your curiosity around topics more than actually drop some defenses along the line? And everyone, feel free to turn your screens on if you like, and give David someone to look at other than Jason LA. Thank you. Thanks, Meg.
But yeah, just by the way, my answer to that is I don't know, but as long as I'm just knocking on this door and I'm not believing that they're doing any real work, I'm not in danger of colluding. And I guess, I'll talk later about what I'd do at that point, but I think if you keep knocking on that door and the curiosity doesn't draw any curiosity on their part or any opening, that's when we need to be fully ready to just do the review and just say, how would you say this is progressing? And at that point, I want to talk to that guy about how long we've spent at this point, but we don't seem to be going anywhere. And I'm wondering what it's like for me to be sort of asking you about territory you don't seem to want to go towards. So, just like we would with anyone, substance abuse or any compulsive behavior, if we're trying to work with that, if I become the enemy, the substance abuser, and they just want to keep defending themselves and go out and use again, that's a painful moment. But it's that thing, our training tells us we can't take responsibility for the outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I suppose the hardest thing about this work is that the more dangerous the guy is, the more likely you are to reach this point of what's the word I'm looking for? Of stagnation. And then when those guys just disappear, that's very uncomfortable. So I'm going to work really hard if we do get that defensiveness to really put my cards on the table and ask them how what's it like to see me really struggling, and let them know that I'm a bit lost here. I'm a bit uncertain as to where we can go. I'm really struggling to move past this, and I'm not sure if I'm, and throw it to them. Are you seeing much progress? Do you feel much progress? And if they sort of say yes, and I'm then exploring, well, tell me, how's that working out for you? What is the progress and how's that working? That's where I get to really contest and say, well, you say that, but to be really honest, I'm not feeling that in the room. And I wonder what that is. And I wonder if you're still really struggling to get into that space where you don't have the control. I'm experiencing you as very in control in here. And I don't know, do you feel like you're taking any risks? God, I sound like a group therapist facilitator here, trying to encourage people to open up. But I think you really have to go there. And unfortunately, if you keep hitting that brick wall and then they disappear, or even if you hit that brick wall, I'll say to these guys, well, I'm really not sure what we can do at this point. And confront them with the idea that, well, we're done. This is it. And then I'm really interested to see, well, what do they do with that if I say I'm done? Because at that point, even that more narcissistic guy, it's like you're sort of saying to them, you failed. And that's going to be intolerable for that person. So, but in answer to that question, I don't see that you've got anywhere else to go with that kind of client at that point, but to show them that you're prepared to see and call the lack of progress, confront that, work with them to overcome it. But again, if the resistance comes up, just to be comfortable calling it that I think we're done and see what they do with that. And you might get one more bite, but maybe not. I tend to think if you've got to this stage, like I said, to me, it's all about paving the way. And I tend to think if you've got to this stage, you've got a fair bit of leverage at that point when you go into that exercise I just sort of went through, of taking them into that moment, So, but I don't know if anyone's got any concerns about that, or if it feels viable for people, or if it's also stuff that might help you conceiving of what victim survivors are dealing with.
No, I think, David, it's really helpful it's really interesting actually to consider another perspective in holding it. I think, as Sophie said, even if it's held in the room, sort of, I work with, where it comes for me is a lot of the clients I work with, this would fit very much for their dads or their parents, that they've grown up with. And I think to understand what it gives me a little bit more of an understanding of their kind of lived experience and the whole family system and how that's sort of played out, which is, it's definitely a different perspective.
Okay.
I'm aware as well of the time, David, so we've probably got about another kind of 5 minutes or so.
Yep, no problem. So, look, I think we're pretty much where we wanted to get that. So as, I just talked through that, that's just that process of really reflecting on that. I guess that last question there, the last two questions there, really exploring with them the difference between the perceived threat and the threat your partner is really presenting to you. And that's an interesting, I think, moment that for a lot of these guys, even if they're quite well defended, they're defended on the basis that they stay in control and they're powerful. And it's that idea that, wow, how dangerous is she? You know, like, what do you fear she's going to actually do to you? And with that more narcissistic or entitled, grandiose kind of client, I think that can be a real moment of confrontation, that what's going on with that gap? You know, like, the pretty strong behaviors, like, you're really acting to exercise control there. Like what's the fear there? You know, what's she going to do to you? But with guys who are more progressive around this, getting it into that next phase, that last question of exploring the difference between their experience at the moment and their partners. And I'm not sure if I've got this after here. Don't know if I put it in, but often a guy at this point, once we've done that exercise, really talking about how complex and difficult this is and how hard it can be to explain to anyone, and just sort of pointing out, you see how much work we've done to get inside this couple of seconds where you cross over. We needed a lot of work, a lot of time to get to this. It's very challenging. How do you feel about explaining this to your partner and communicating this information? I think I've got that sort of here. Yeah, not quite, but yeah, just, and at that point, I'll really challenge the guy or offer to that client the possibility of bringing their partner in. And to me, that's another really key moment, because if there's no way, and you'll see that reaction very quickly, whether it's no or let me think about that, I can see pros and cons, I'm quite attached to this process and I want to protect it. Or if it's yes, or like, yeah, that could be good, you're finding a lot out about where this guy's at and how much that guy's letting you in on what's going on in the room. Sorry, what's going on outside the room when he goes home, and what he's telling you is going on. So, and surprisingly enough, I would say 50% of guys at this point are really open to that idea, and probably at least half of them go on to bringing their partners in. And the partner just has an opportunity. I give the partner the opportunity to ask as many questions as she has. It's normally shared a couple of times with same-sex partners, where the other partners come in, and just being able to ask lots of questions and show their concern. And then that gives us a lot of stuff to work with if the therapy process is continuing. So they're the responses that you're looking out for. Again, just when we're sort of finishing off that client profile, you know, what does the client do with that process? Could they get through it? Could they assimilate the information, apply it to themselves? As you're trying to talk through it, do they start attacking themselves? Are they self-critical when they're around shame? Do they distract with details, dissociate, blame partners? Or we're going to give you a lot of information. So there's that idea of, you know, to me, this is, I say to them, right, now we're doing the work. And I really want to let them in that everything we've done gets us to this point, and now we can actually start working. And that's when we'll sort of talk about what do we need to support you in mapping and changing the way you respond in those moments, because we're seeing that it's stages. And that's where we really raise this question of what do you want, and do we need to continue? So yeah, I won't go into that too much. Just as a little metaphor, I don't know, I put this, the light bulb is not the light. And that's just a metaphor I work with guys, that in that moment when they cross over, they experience it like a switch. And I'll often go to the light switch and turn the light on, turn the light off, and it looks like it's the same thing. And guys love this stuff. You know, you sort of point out that how many components are there between that light switch? and the light bulb. And so, oh yeah, well, and then we go through them. It's like there's the switch, there's the wiring, then you've got electricity, a power source, and just show them that process that you're experiencing as instantaneous is actually made up of all these different components. And now we're in here. Do you want to do the work and map them out and get clear on them and create options where at the moment it feels like it's all automaticity, So I hope that's sort of landing okay. To me, if we can get guys into that place, we're really in this prevention category. Because, I suppose that's my sort of fantasy with this. If guys can become curious about this, and I think we are seeing it, guys are coming in earlier and earlier. Guys that once were showing up, in family court and all sorts of disastrous situations are coming in much earlier in the stage of what I think is where it shows up in the development of intimacy. And when they can't find any good reason not to believe in intimacy, and it becomes pretty visible that it's them that has the problem, they're coming in at that stage going, oh, I'm drinking too much, or I'm losing it, or I'm having these ridiculous fights with my partner, starting to affect the kids. I really don't like it. So the more we can sort of normalize this, from where I'm coming from, the more we get those guys thinking maybe they could put their hand up a little earlier in the process. So I hope that's all landed okay. I would love to be sort of in a room with people and find out what you really think. So if anyone does have any thoughts or any feedback or anything that you feel like, was a bit labored for you guys or wasn't explained enough, or you would like a different kind of explanation that would help, I would love your feedback on this, because I really want to develop this, and it's challenging material. To know how to land.
Sorry, we'll send out a feedback form via your emails, everyone, just to get some feedback from you. We have some standard questions, but we might actually have a little chat with David and throw in some extras as well, or there's opportunity just to write some qualitative feedback as well in those feedback forms. So that'd be really helpful. We always ask people to be really honest in those forms, because that's the only way we can grow and receive feedback. So we're pretty good at feedback, or we like to think we are.
Oh, great. Excellent. Because this is, normally when we talk about this and do presentations, we do a lot more stuff on profiling and etiology, and it's normally more at the pointy end.
Yeah.
So, a little more diffuse.
David, one of the thoughts I had was their anger at you for actually triggering the shame spiral in that process as well, right? Because it's like, now you've got me angry, God damn it, or I don't know. But
yeah, well, that's why I love the whiteboard. It's sort of I'm over here with you. No, it wasn't me.
Yeah. I can draw a bomb on the whiteboard and we can play it together. All right.
It came from out there.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you, Sophie and Jace, for inviting me along and giving me a chance to have a chat about it. Really appreciate it.
Oh, our pleasure.
Oh, David, we're so grateful for you. And I always feel like the world is better for, amazing men like you doing therapy like this. We are grateful to have you in this space. I feel that way both as a colleague, clinician in this space, and as a friend, so we're so grateful to you. We really appreciate your time tonight. Grateful for everyone turning up. I know it's a hard topic to spend a Thursday night on, so really appreciate everyone participating tonight as well. So unless there's anything burning, we might close off on that.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.